This is an issue like seatbelts or airbags. This will happen eventually.
Cleared for takeoff, Transcon 47.
It's been over a year since that deadly midair collision over the Potomac River, when a Black Hawk military helicopter collided with American Airlines PSA Flight 5342 over the Potomac River. Well, since then, so many things have changed and some things haven't changed. The NTSB has released its final report. The agency has recommended dozens of changes for the FAA to consider regarding safety, and lawmakers have considered passing a bill that could possibly prevent future accidents like this one from ever happening again, but it failed to pass. So there's still much work to do. So today we're going to speak with Tim and Sherry Lilly, the family of Sam Lilly. And Sam was the first officer on American Airlines PSA Flight 5342. Now, since the crash, Tim and Sherry have spent months and months and months using the tragic death of 67 people, including their son, to advocate for aviation safety changes. So the NTSB concluded the crash was 100% preventable, and while there were numerous factors that contributed to the crash, really it all boiled down to the fact that the helicopter was at the wrong altitude. So Tim and Sherry, we welcome you in a great picture of Sam there in the cockpit. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've done a million of these podcasts and conversations because it is your goal now to make changes so desperately needed. How are you guys doing?
Hey, it's been a very tough year, a little over a year now, but there's been a lot of good changes. And for one, Route 4 is permanently closed, so we won't have helicopters crossing the approach and runway 33. So that's a good thing. But as you know, there's some legislation that needs to get done, and we had the Rotor Act. The Rotor Act, if you're familiar with ADS-B, and that is a collision avoidance technology where the aircraft will transmit its position, and so that's ADS-B out. And then other aircraft and air traffic control can receive that position. That's called ADS-B in. And so the Rotor Act was gonna require both ADS-B in and ADS-B out, and it passed the Senate unanimously. And then it failed to pass the House on exception, which you would need 2/3. It only missed by one vote, so just barely failed to pass.
You know, I cannot imagine how you felt. And Sherry, I know that you were there when this decision was made, and I just cannot imagine. First of all, how could that have happened? I think everybody just assumed it would pass. How could that not pass? How could it not? And Sherry, you were in the gallery watching the vote. So at that moment, what was that like for you and the other families?
Well, I will tell you that we were a little bit disappointed by the fact that there were even two different pieces of legislation. Like Tim mentions, the Rotor Act, we had been involved together with the NTSB, representation from air traffic control, flight attendant, and pilot unions had really helped collaborate with legislative staff from the Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Cruz and Senator Cantwell staffs, to draft all of that legislation. There were some people who questioned why it was being drafted before the NTSB final report even came out. But it was obvious, really, from the very beginning, and even more so during the investigative hearing last summer, that a loss of separation was certainly going to be one of the causal factors. And also, we knew that the ability for the military to waive broadcast of ADS-B out, which is mandated in that airspace.
That's right.
They had a memorandum of understanding between the FAA and the U.S. Army to allow them to waive that requirement. And the approval process was not rigorous enough, that it was being abused. That waiver was being used consistently. So those were the two items that emerged as issues extremely early. So the staffs of Senator Cruz and Cantwell had started drafting that legislation. We were able to review drafts and give them input. And we thought this is a great start. We knew there would be other recommendations that would come from the final report from the NTSB. And we had thought if there is additional need for a legislative mandate for some of those other recommendations, that could come later. There could be some companion legislation. So we had really perceived the Rotor Act as the first bit of legislation that would pass. We were so encouraged on December 17th when that passed the Senate unanimously.
Right, right.
We thought, all these legislators are taking this aviation safety, mitigating the risks so seriously. It had been championed just, so vigorously by both Senators Cruz and Cantwell. But when it went over to the House, there was a piece of legislation that wasn't really a companion. It was seeking to create some additional legislative language around the collision avoidance, around, pilot awareness, and a lot of other recommendations coming out of that final report. And to be honest, we thought it was it was quite aggressive. It was a lot included. So we had perceived that there may be some pushback. However, we also thought there are some specific carve-outs that are maybe trying to get around some of that pushback. But sitting up in that gallery watching that vote happen, it was a 5-minute vote, and we were watching the tally, and we would think, it's moving ahead. Look at all the ayes. It's going to pass. But then the nays overruled. There was an entire group of senators, Democratic contingent, that couldn't make it in from the New England area because of the terrible snowstorms they had had.
Yeah.
And we had thought they definitely would have backed it. They went on the record afterwards saying we would have voted in the affirmative. So we knew that it was critical that they weren't there. But it was very disappointing to see some of the legislators who voted against it.
So they can't do a recount. I know that's a dumb question. Can they do a recount because of the storm?
They would have to bring it up under the normal process instead of they were bringing it up under exception, which you need 2/3, and under the regular process you only need a majority, and so we may see it come up again.
Well, let me clarify, though. It needs a majority. However, it is subject to debate, and it is subject to a lot of amendments being added on at that point, which could present an obstacle to it being approved, even by a simple majority.
Sure, and just to be clear, the reason that the Rotor Act made so much sense even before the final NTSB report was out is the NTSB first started recommending ADS-BN in congested airspace way back in 2008, and they've recommended it 17 times since then. And so this was no surprise, and we knew not just would the CRJ would have had a much earlier warning about where the helicopter was, but also they would have been able to see what direction it was going in and what altitude it was at much more clearly. As you know, TCAS in the landing configuration is not very accurate. I personally been landing a jet and it shows traffic on the exact opposite side of where it actually is when you're at those low altitudes. And so ADS-B is much more accurate, but not only would the CRJ been able to see the helicopter, but the helicopter would have actually understood where the CRJ is. I don't believe that the helicopter crew ever understood that CRJ was getting ready to land on 3-3. I think their confirmation bias came into play, and they were looking for aircraft on runway 1. And so had they had an ADS-B in and they were using it, then, they would have obviously not flown that down that route in that direction. So
Tim,
there's
we're,
that as
we're
well.
gonna take a break, and when we come back, let's talk more about that and automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. I want to talk a little bit about exactly what that is and the difference between in and out, and the fact that I thought I had heard that in the military helicopter that the altimeter wasn't even correct. The altimeter setting was wrong, and it can be off by as much as 75 feet. Yet in that airspace, they have to be closer than that. Let's just talk about what that happened and why it is important for everybody to be using ADSB, at least out, because that's what the law says. But then that's what the law says. That's what I have to abide by as a pilot, and so do you in Class Bravo airspace. We're going to talk about that, and then what's next. But we got to take a quick break, and we'll be right back when Inside the Cockpit continues right after this. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Inside the Cockpit. We're talking with Tim and Sherry Lilly, the family of Sam Lilly, the first officer who perished in that horrific Potomac River midair collision with the military Black Hawk helicopter. We're talking about ADSB, so let's just explain what that is. Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. This is just technology that broadcasts out an aircraft's position, its exact GPS position, its altitude, its airspeed, based on GPS. So it's more accurate than based on radar, what we had in the old days. Now, years ago, we used to have like a Mode C transponder that would tell you what your altitude was, and that was required. This is just much more precise. ADSB out. All aircraft in this congested type airspace, which is in the DC area, also in Charlotte, in Atlanta, and busy airspaces, have to have this equipment on board. This is required. However, military operations don't have to have that. Tim, can you tell me why and the difference it would have made? First of all, the helicopter wasn't broadcasting any type of ADSB, correct?
That is correct. So they weren't broadcasting ADSB out, and they were doing that on a memorandum of understanding with the FAA. And so what had happened was they had this understanding with the FAA that for critical missions, they wouldn't transmit ADSB out because for national security reasons, but they took it too far. And so this was not a critical mission that needed to be kept a secret. They were flying on published routes um, in an airspace where everybody knew where they were. And so on a training mission, it was just a check right. And so there was no reason for them not to have been transmitting the ADSB out. Now, that being said, the CRJ, the way CRJs are currently configured, do not have the capability of receiving ADSB. So that's ADSB in. Okay, so one of the loopholes we need to also close is require aircraft operating in Class B airspace and other congested airspace to have ADSB in. And it's much more accurate than TCAS. And not only that, but it gives a pilot a trajectory and an altitude of where that other aircraft is in a pictorial way, not just a diamond that's kind of dancing around the screen. It's more like an arrow that shows which direction it's going, whether it's climbing or descending, what its altitude is. And so you have a very clear picture of where that aircraft actually is.
So the CRJ had ADSB out so that
Yes.
ATC could read their position. If other aircraft in the vicinity had ADSB in, they could have read that information also. But the CRJ has TCAS, a traffic collision avoidance system that will give them an alert, traffic, or a resolution. But
Right.
what you're saying is if it had had ADSB out, which is very expensive, I understand, is that perhaps one of the problems? They
So
would have had more time to react to the helicopter? Tell me about that, Tim.
right. So ADS-BN is a proven technology. You're going to have some that say that it's not. It's a simple, you're not going to be able to do this in a CRJ, but in general aviation, you can receive it on an iPad, right, with a Stratus device. And that Stratus device is a receiver of ADS-BN. It's just like $400 or $500. And then you can display it just right on your iPad along with your charts and see where all the traffic is in near real time within a fraction of a second. So just about real time. Um, the problem with the CRJ is the avionics. Instead of they have CRTs, which is an older kind of display, and so to integrate that is going to cost some money. Newer aircraft, it's going to be fairly inexpensive. On the newer aircraft that are being taken delivery from, say, American Airlines and their subsidies, Probably only like $50,000 an aircraft. But CRJ a little bit more, right? Because you're going to have to retrofit into a older avionics system.
Are there going to be any answers to this anytime soon? It just seems like you are in a position where you've devoted so much time. How do you make sense of the fact that the Rotor Act didn't go through? How do you do? I know you're people of faith and you have worked very hard. And do you
Yes.
think things happen for a reason? And what would be the reason for this that would make sense?
We do. I mean, we know that there are certain segments of aviation that may push back against that ADSB in mandate, and we are collaborating now with the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee a bit. We've just started meeting with them, and hopefully we will have the ability to send them feedback and input around the alert bill because
Yeah.
it's got some pretty big holes that.
Tell me about the alert bill, and how that's different from the Rotor Act.
Yes, so the alert bill is has been positioned as much more comprehensive in addressing all of the recommendations. However, the NTSB undertook a pretty rigorous analysis of that legislation and has really refuted that statement. They said that's not completely accurate. We need to go on the record as the safety agency that we're not endorsing that legislation as it is written right now because it does not address all of our recommendations. So, unions and family members are also coming alongside the NTSB pushing to have input to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee around modifications and redlining of that text. As we were talking about a little bit earlier, we don't believe that it would have the ability to even pass with a simple majority right now because we have publicized our opposition to it in its current form. So
Right.
we're hoping to see if that legislation moves forward, that there's some significant changes around it. There still is a possible path for the Rotor Act. There are a couple of avenues that it could go down. So we're keeping our finger on the pulse of what could happen there also.
The biggest thing about the Alert Act that really that we're pushing back on is rather than mandate ADSB in, it has a series of committees and rulemaking and a long process. And the problem with that is we've seen this movie before. ADSB was mandated once before. When it went to rulemaking, it came back to Congress and they dropped the requirement. That was in 2018. Had they followed through on their previous commitment, we wouldn't be having this conversation and our son would still be alive. And so our biggest problem is with the Alert Act, this rulemaking that it's done by all of the stakeholders. And we just think that there's too much room for that to and too many carve outs. Like for instance, in the way that the Alert Act is written, it exempts 91K. And I work for a 91K operator, and I think that's crazy. We fly thousands of jets into complex airports and airspace every single day, and there's no reason that we should be exempt. We're flying modern aircraft too. It would not be very difficult to modify and meet the requirements.
One of the other issues in the Alert Act that we have deep concerns about is it does not repeal Section 373 in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the DoD budget that as it was passed, that even expanded the ability for the military to waive ADSB out with no oversight whatsoever. So we were alarmed when we saw that. It seems like it got sneaked into that enormous bill and everyone didn't realize that it was in there. And the Rotor Act explicitly had language to repeal it,
Right.
but the Alert Act does not. So the guardrails around the military being able to utilize waivers, we do recognize that sometimes there are mission critical There are missions that are being flown that do need to have that level of secrecy, but it's no one believes that the military should be self-approving those waivers.
This is so complicated. I don't know how you all keep up with all this and all the stress you have been under. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back when Inside the Cockpit returns. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of Inside the Cockpit. Tim and Sherry Lilly, our special guests today, talking about lessons learned and hopefully changes that can be made to prevent accidents like the one that happened over the Potomac River last year, when an American Airlines jet was collided with a Army Black Hawk helicopter. So you folks have been so busy being an advocate for safety, talking about the Alert Act. By the way, the Alert Act, Airspace Location and Enhanced Risk Transparency Act of 2026. It's a mouthful. There's so much involved with this. How quickly can changes be made? Because we've got this busy airspace out there, and even though helicopter route has been shut down, you've still got the option or a loophole for military helicopter to be flying without their location being broadcast. How quickly can these changes come, and is it too little, too late?
Well, the NTSB, when they make recommendations, you don't have to, those organizations don't have to wait for legislation to start enacting them. So hopefully, the military is working on theirs and the FAA is working on theirs already. The Alert Act, the main timeline, should be completed by 2031 if everything goes as planned. I imagine that that timeline is very aggressive and it will probably slip. But, we're hoping, to get some changes made to the Alert Act, and if we can get those changes through, that will at least have the majority of aircraft transmitting and receiving ADS-BN in congested airspace, by 2031.
And honestly, we feel like this is an issue like seatbelts or airbags. This will happen eventually. And our challenge really for legislators and for all of the operators who would be required to implement ADS-BN is let's embrace this higher level of safety. Let's ensure that the pilots in the airspace are not just trying to see and avoid other aircraft, but they can actually see and be seen, a higher level of safety standard. And they, like Tim said, certain operators, certain government agencies could begin acting now. They don't have to wait for legislation.
Right. When you, if you are able to watch the NTSB animations, what you can see from the CRJ crew is they were completely acting vigilant, and doing everything they were supposed to do. But, see and avoid just isn't good enough with the eyes because there's so many limitations. You don't have magic vision. You can't see aircraft when they're backlit by the city or if they're, below and to the right. And so, ADS-BN and other, technologies can eliminate that, situational awareness that a pilot just can't get with the naked eye.
Right, and especially coming into land and all the lights at night, you can't tell where the horizon is and where the lights are the stars or airplanes or the lights on the ground. Yeah, it's a very, very difficult. You'll have experienced just a horrific loss. You and the families and of Pat 25 also are military
Yes.
families. How has this changed you?
Oh, for me and my aviation career, it's changed me quite a bit because traditionally, I was in military for 20 years and then I flew EMS. I flew for hospitals for 17 years. And so I'm very focused on completing missions and getting the job done. And now I'm way more focused on the safety aspect of it. And so if a flight can't go and be as safe as possible, that I'm just gonna put it off until I can uh, get that safety factor up to the level it needs to be. In our personal life, hey, I know that I'm going to see Sam and fly with Sam again, and God just put a lot of people into our lives to help facilitate us being able to advocate for aviation safety. So we feel like, you know, a lot of things happen for a reason. You know, we miss Sam terribly. I'm comforted in the fact that death has very little sting for me because, we're going to live an eternal life and we'll all be together again.
Sherry, yeah, how do you make sense of such a loss like this? And for other families that are going through grief, perhaps of different types, what advice do you have for them? What have you learned?
Well, I think a lesson that really I acknowledged it, I guess, a few months ago, that you can't go through a loss like this and go back to normal. Lots of people will say, "It's been a year. You guys should be back to normal now." But I think they underestimate the impact that grief has on your life and how it changes you as a person. I know for me personally, I worked for 15 years at Gulfstream, and it's caused me to have a reckoning. Why do I have aviation knowledge that I'm not using? So I've been very encouraged by opportunities to speak to people like you and utilize some of that knowledge. And I feel like I probably need to continue doing that. So I understand that's a common psychological response a lot of family members have after a tragedy like this, that they will rethink careers and life mission and purpose. And I think we're all grappling with that. And who do we become now on the other side of this tragedy?
And it's interesting, it's like everything in life that we've experienced prepares us for where we are today. So Tim
Absolutely.
Tim, look at your background. Gosh, a Black Hawk helicopter pilot and a CRJ pilot, and Sherry, your experience, everything has led you to this. It's just heartbreaking, but the difference you're making, we're just privileged and honored to be in your presence and what you are doing to help the flying public, and we just send you blessings as your grief journey continues. Tim and Sherry Lilly, and we thank all of you for joining us here on Inside the Cockpit. I'm May K. Bueller with Queen City News. We'll see you next time.
Queen City News Plus. Just search Queen City News on your smart TV's app store.